The collapse never begins with an explosion. It begins with a number. A percentage point slipping quietly below zero. A bond yield twisting in the wrong direction. A whisper between traders before the screens ignite in a shade of red that feels almost biological, like fresh blood spreading across a wound no one knew existed. In our story, the day the world fractures looks like every other morning. No storms, no alarms, just a strange stillness in the markets, the kind that seasoned investors compare to the moment before a fault line rips open. At 9:31 a.m., a liquidity vacuum appears, tiny, almost invisible, yet powerful enough to pull entire currencies into its gravitational field. Within minutes, Asia, Europe, and the US are synchronized in panic, as if someone flipped a global switch. But the truth is more disturbing. No single nation caused this. No corporation stood on the edge of recklessness. This collapse feels coordinated, not by human hands, but by a structure, an architecture of ownership so vast and intertwined that when one of its pillars trembles, the entire system convulses like a single organism. People rush to find explanations. Politicians speak of temporary instability. Economists point to unexpected volatility. But beneath the public statements, behind the closed doors of central banks, a different emotion reigns. Fear. Not the fear of losing elections or reputations, but the fear of losing control, because they all know something the public does not. Ownership has become so concentrated, so silently centralized, that when the core shakes, everything shakes. Supply chains stall. Cargo ships drift offshore with no instructions. Factories lock their gates. Energy grids falter. Supermarkets ration inventory. What should be local disruptions become continental collapses. It feels less like a market crash and more like a seizure. And as chaos unfolds, one recurring question spreads among those who look deeply enough. How can a world with 8 billion people be so fragile that a single shift in capital can bring it to its knees? The answer, of course, has been hiding in plain sight for decades. Because behind every product on the shelf, behind every corporation's glossy brand, behind every independent household name, there is an invisible chain of ownership, recursive, overlapping, recursive again, looping back to the same small circle of entities. They don't advertise, they don't innovate, they don't entertain, they simply own. And with ownership comes control, subtle but absolute. This is not conspiracy, it is arithmetic. A handful of funds now sit atop the global financial hierarchy, woven into every index, every retirement plan, every mortgage-backed instrument, every multinational boardroom. They are the silent shareholders of the world, the stewards of capital that does not belong to them, but obeys them nonetheless. They do not need to dictate policy, they simply steer capital. And capital, in our time, is more powerful than governments. So when something goes wrong in the system, when one thread in this tangled web is pulled, every strand vibrates. Markets feel it first. Nations feel it next. Ordinary people feel it last, in the form of rising food prices, failing banks, evaporating savings. In the storyline of this collapse, news anchors scramble for metaphors. A chain reaction, a financial tsunami, a synchronized downturn. None dare speak the truth. This isn't a chain reaction, it's a single reaction, because the world's economy has silently become a single entity, and entities can break. Families watch retirement accounts bleed out in real time. Business owners beg banks for extensions that will never come. Governments hold emergency summits only to discover that their sovereignty has always been conditional. Conditional on the goodwill of the capital holders, who now tighten their grip in strategic silence. In every previous crisis there were villains, reckless borrowers, greedy bankers, speculative bubbles. But this time the villain is harder to name. It has no face, no logo, no headquarters with a neon sign. It exists as an algorithmic heartbeat pulsing through global markets, pulling the strings of companies that appear independent, yet are merely limbs of a single financial organism, masquerading as plurality. And here lies the horror. If the world feels like it's collapsing in unison, It's because it is owned in unison. The day ends with markets frozen, governments stunned, and citizens staring at screens that show numbers they can't comprehend. But the real story is not today's collapse. It's the system that made such a collapse possible. Because behind all the red blinking across the world, one realization forms in the shadows. This was never about Apple, Google, or any corporation we thought dominated the planet. The true power has always been held by something quieter, older, and more deeply rooted. A company that doesn't need to sell you anything. A company that doesn't need to be loved. A company that owns. And for the first time, the world has glimpsed what happens when that ownership trembles. History does not repeat itself in headlines. It repeats in structures, in the quiet architecture of power that most people never notice until it's too late. When you step back far enough, the chaos of the present begins to resemble something ancient, almost mathematical. A pattern, a loop, a design that keeps resurfacing across centuries, wearing different masks, but driven by the same logic. Ownership becomes influence, influence becomes control, and control becomes destiny. The pattern begins long before modern markets existed, before skyscrapers, before futures contracts, before digital tickers pulsed through the veins of global finance. It begins with empire. Not the kind defined by territory, but the empire of capital. The ability to command resources without ever touching them. You see, every era has its shadow owner. In the 1600s, it was a chartered company that behaved like a sovereign state. The East India Company didn't merely trade spices. It engineered wars, redrew borders, and manipulated monarchs. It proved a dangerous truth. When a private entity becomes indispensable to a nation's economy, that nation becomes a vessel, not a master. The company's power came from a simple asymmetry. The public saw ships, warehouses, and soldiers, but the real engine was hidden within its ownership ledger. Fast forward to the late 1800s, another giant rises. Standard Oil. It controlled not just refineries, but railroads, pipelines, distribution networks. It wrapped itself around the lifeblood of industrial society so tightly that politicians could barely breathe without Rockefeller's approval. Regulators eventually shattered it, but not before the world learned another brutal lesson. Monopoly is not merely a business model, it is a political force. Then came the banking cartels of the early 20th century. Private institutions writing the rules of national currencies, deciding which governments thrived and which ones defaulted. Even wars bent around their decisions. Again, the public saw only the visible structure, banks, vaults, interest rates. But beneath it lay the real mechanism, a consolidation of ownership so concentrated it could tilt global stability with a single coordinated decision. 3 eras, 3 empires, 1 pattern. Every time wealth centralizes, power becomes unaccountable. Every time ownership condenses into the hands of the few, nations become actors in a script they did not write. And every time the public believes the system is too complex to question, that is when the system becomes most dangerous. What makes the pattern terrifying is not its existence. It is its subtlety. No tyrant announces their reign. No corporation admits its influence. No empire declares that it rules the world. The pattern works because people assume freedom while living within structures controlled by entities they will never meet, whose names rarely surface in public discourse. Real power hides in paperwork, not parliaments. And today, the structure is more intricate, more invisible, and more mathematically efficient than anything the East India Company, Standard Oil, or the early banking houses could have imagined. Because unlike the past, where monopolies were tangible and easy to point at, modern ownership is a maze, a web of cross-holdings, index funds, passive investments, derivative overlays, and proxy voting rights. A system where millions believe they own pieces of companies, yet a tiny circle of institutions actually wields the voting power. The pattern now operates silently, buried inside algorithms that rebalance global portfolios without human hands. concentrating influence not through conquest, but through automation. The owners do not need armies, they need flows, predictable, steady, obedient flows of capital from billions of people who never ask where their money sleeps at night. And so the cycle repeats, but with a new twist. The concentration is no longer national, it is planetary. This is the true evolution of the pattern. Ownership has escaped borders. It has transcended governments. It has outgrown regulation. It exists in a void above nations, where accountability evaporates and influence compounds quietly, like interest on a debt the world doesn't realize it owes. The public still believes in competition. They see rival brands, rival companies, rival industries. But competition is an illusion when the same entity sits at the top of every ownership pyramid. Just as the citizens of past empires never realized how thoroughly their fates were tied to a single company's decisions, modern society drifts through its routines, unaware of the invisible consolidation wrapping around it like a tightening coil. The pattern is simple, elegant, terrifying. Step 1. Fragment the world into thousands of companies. Step 2. Allow the public to believe they participate through ownership. Step 3. Centralize the voting power of those companies into a handful of institutions. Step 4. Control the world by controlling the capital that controls everything else. This is why the collapse we witnessed in Part 1 felt unified, synchronized, unnatural, because the world economy is no longer a diverse ecosystem. It is a monoculture of ownership, a single forest where every tree is rooted in the same soil. If that soil trembles, the entire forest falls at once. History is not repeating by accident. It is repeating because we allowed the same structure to grow again, only larger, more complex, and more untouchable than ever before. The pattern has returned, and this time, it spans the entire world. History warns us in whispers before it screams, and if you listen closely, the sound we hear today is not new. It is the echo of empires past vibrating through modern machinery. The names have changed, the tools have evolved, but the architecture of control? It is almost identical. The East India Company had royal charters, Standard Oil had pipelines, the banking cartels had gold reserves and signatures on national ledgers. Today's power uses something deceptively benign, the index. The modern world worships convenience, automated investing, passive funds, one-click portfolios. Entire generations have been trained to believe that the safest way to grow wealth is to hand it over to algorithms that promise stability. It feels harmless, almost virtuous. Set your retirement on autopilot and forget about it. But here lies the parallel that history never expected us to notice. Every time the public becomes passive, power becomes active. Decades ago, investors selected individual companies. They made choices. They voted with intention. Ownership was distributed, flawed but dispersed enough to prevent a single point of failure. Today, capital flows through a funnel so narrow that almost every major corporation in the world traces back to the same handful of asset managers. And unlike the titans of the past, these institutions don't need to build railroads or refineries. They don't need armies or paid militias. Their influence stems from a quieter weapon, proxy voting rights, the modern equivalent of imperial decree. To the average person, a proxy vote means nothing, a line of text buried in a quarterly statement. But extrapolated billions of times across every industry, it becomes the steering wheel of the global economy. It decides CEO appointments, it selects policies, it shapes environmental regulations, it influences wars by redirecting capital from one geopolitical bloc to another. This is the new empire, an empire without a flag. And here is the parallel that should terrify us. Just as the East India Company expanded through monopolies disguised as trade, modern asset managers expand through indexation disguised as diversification. People believe they are spreading risk across thousands of companies, but in reality, they are consolidating power into a single source. A forest of trees with only one root system. 1,000 brands controlled by a dozen hands. A global marketplace that looks competitive until you peel back the first layer and see the same names behind every curtain. The public still clings to the illusion of corporate rivalry. Apple versus Samsung, Coca-Cola versus Pepsi, Amazon versus Walmart. But pull the ownership records and the pattern reveals itself again. The same controlling entities sit atop both sides of every supposed battle. They profit not from who wins, but from the fact that the world keeps playing the game. This is the parallel to the oil monopolies of the past, only scaled to the entire economy. When you own the infrastructure itself, the pipelines, the refineries, the distribution, the outcome of the competition becomes irrelevant. Today's infrastructure is financial. Today's pipelines are flows of capital. Today's refineries are index funds. And today's monopolies are invisible because they do not operate like companies. They operate like gravity. In previous eras, governments at least attempted to restrain the monopolists. Parliament took on the East India Company. The US broke up Standard Oil. Regulators imposed firewalls between banking institutions. But now, who can regulate an entity that owns pieces of every regulator? Who can restrain a structure that underpins the pensions of millions? Who dares challenge a system so embedded that disrupting it would collapse the very societies trying to fight it? This is the new twist in the historical parallel. The empire has become too essential to dismantle, too interconnected to confront, too invisible for the public to even identify. And while past monopolies operated in the physical world, trade routes, oil fields, vaults, the modern ones operate inside financial abstractions so complex that even experts struggle to map them. Complexity is their camouflage. Scale is their shield. Passivity is their fuel. The parallels align so perfectly it feels orchestrated. A small group centralizes ownership. Nations become dependent on their capital. Public wealth flows into private hands in the name of efficiency. Power concentrates until it becomes indistinguishable from governance itself. We have lived this story before, but never on this magnitude. Never with this level of automation. Never with this degree of global synchronization. The past was a warning, the present is a rhyme, and the future, unless interrupted, is the final verse of a pattern centuries in the making. There comes a moment in every story of power when the mask slips, when the invisible hand becomes visible, when the structure we assumed was too complex to understand suddenly resolves into something simple, almost elegant, and profoundly unsettling. The moment arrives quietly, not with a whistleblower, not with a scandal, but with a single realization. The world is not controlled by industries, it is controlled by the owners of industries. For decades, we've been trained to look at corporations as giants, towering, competitive, autonomous. But giants are only giants when viewed from the ground. From above, they resemble pieces on a board, and the true player is the one who moves them. And now, finally, the silhouette of that player comes into focus. Behind the collapse, behind the pattern, behind the parallels, lies a company that doesn't fit the traditional definition of a company at all. It produces nothing, it sells nothing. It manufactures no devices, no media, no chemicals, no cars. Yet it stands behind every device, every film, every drug, every engine. It sits quietly at the top of ownership charts, an omnipresent ghost embedded into the DNA of global capitalism. The company that owns the world. Not Apple, not Google, not Tesla, not any name crowds debate halls or magazine lists. This entity operates on a different plane. It doesn't want customers, it wants assets. It doesn't seek attention, it seeks control. And control in the modern age comes not from profit, but from custody of capital. Its power is not symbolic, it is mathematical. Across thousands of corporations, in every sector, in every region, in every economy that matters, its fingerprints appear. It sits among the top shareholders of nearly every major institution on Earth. Banks, energy giants, tech titans, pharmaceutical conglomerates, even defense contractors and media empires. The world believes these companies stand alone, But peel back the ownership charts, and the truth becomes impossible to ignore. They all answer, ultimately, to the same silent shareholder. And this is the revelation the world was never meant to see: a single financial organism with tentacles in every sector, every market, every continent, shaping capitalism not by force, but by structure. Its influence flows through three channels. First, ownership. Not majority stakes, but strategic stakes, enough to sway boards, enough to influence policy, enough to make CEOs whisper before they act. Second, capital flow. Billions of dollars moving through its funds every day, granting it the ability to reward loyalty and punish defiance merely by redirecting the flow. Third, proxy power. The true throne. The right to vote on behalf of millions who unknowingly ceded their voice the moment they chose passive investing. A silent transfer of sovereignty, traded for convenience. This is not conspiracy, it is architecture, the final evolution of the ownership pattern that has ruled every empire before ours. Only this time, the empire has no borders, no legislature, no public accountability. It operates in a realm beyond democracy, beyond nationality, beyond oversight. It is the shadow state of global capitalism. And as the world collapses in unison, something becomes clear. The tremor did not begin in a single industry, because the industries themselves were never truly separate. They have all been fused at the top into a single structure controlled by the same custodian. This is why governments freeze during crisis, why markets fall together, why corporations shift strategy in eerie synchronization. Not because they coordinate, but because their owner does. The company that owns the world does not need to command. It simply reallocates assets, and the world reacts. What makes the revelation terrifying is its simplicity. For centuries, power relied on armies, navies, militias, political dynasties. Today, a handful of signatures buried in regulatory documents, unnoticed by the public, control more wealth than the largest empires of antiquity. The company doesn't lobby, it appoints. It doesn't fight, it reallocates. It doesn't conquer, it absorbs. And because its power is derived not from physical assets but from belief, the belief that passive investing is safe, that index funds are neutral, that diversification protects us, its rule is almost spiritual, a religion of trust, a faith in stability that hides the very instability it causes. If the public understood the scale of this consolidation, the system would not survive the week. But the brilliance of the structure is that it remains unseen, camouflaged behind familiar brands and comforting narratives. Only during collapse does the ghost become visible, and by then, it's already too late. This is the hidden empire, the custodian of nations, the silent shareholder of the planet, the company that owns the world. And now that we've seen it, the question is no longer whether it exists. The question is, what happens next? When a world built on invisible ownership finally confronts the owner. Every story of power ends the same way, not with triumph, but with exposure. The moment the public finally sees the machinery behind the curtain, the moment the illusion fractures, the moment the titan realizes it can no longer hide in the shadows. History teaches us that empires do not fall because they are weak. They fall because the people beneath them finally understand how they were built. And now, for the first time, the world is beginning to understand. Once the revelation becomes undeniable, once the public sees the ownership chain looping back to the same silent entity over and over again, something irreversible happens. The myth of invincibility dissolves. The company that owns the world thrives on opacity, on the belief that its structure is too complex to question, too integral to challenge, too large to fail. But the moment people start tracing the lines, mapping the connections, questioning the narratives, the architecture begins to tremble. Because power built on passivity cannot survive awareness. The company never feared governments, it feared attention. It never feared regulation, it feared comprehension. It never feared revolt, it feared recognition. And recognition is now spreading faster than capital ever did. This is the inevitability. Once people see the pattern, they cannot unsee it. The empire of passive ownership begins to weaken the moment the public becomes active. When individuals reclaim their voice, directing their investments, demanding transparency, refusing to outsource sovereignty to algorithms, the machinery that consolidated global power starts to unwind. Slowly at first, then faster. The same way monopolies of the past crumbled when people realized they were never unstoppable, only unchallenged. History gives us a paradox. The more centralized a system becomes, the more fragile it becomes. The tighter the grip, the easier it is to shatter. The company that owns the world has constructed the most centralized financial organism in human history, but that also means a single shift in collective behavior can fracture it. Owning the world is easy when everyone is asleep, but the world is waking up. Governments, once paralyzed, begin reasserting autonomy as public pressure mounts. Regulators, long submissive, rediscover the courage that defined earlier eras of trust-busting. Citizens, stripped of illusions, begin moving toward real assets, real ownership, real sovereignty. Gold, land, local enterprise, decentralized systems. Things that cannot be quietly absorbed or co-opted. And something even more important happens. Narrative shifts. The belief that this is just how the system works loses its grip. People begin asking why global markets are governed by entities they never elected. Why their retirement funds empower institutions they do not trust. Why companies that shape their lives answer to shareholders they cannot see. The company's greatest strength, being everywhere, becomes its greatest vulnerability. Because when everyone sees the same ghost, the ghost can no longer hide. But inevitability is not just about collapse. It is also about rebirth. As the old structure begins to crack, a new possibility emerges. A world where ownership is no longer concentrated into a single financial monolith. A world where markets function as ecosystems again, not as branches of a single tree. A world where sovereignty is distributed rather than captured, where individuals understand the power of where they place their capital, where nations reclaim economic self-determination. This future is not guaranteed, but it is possible. And possibilities become realities the moment enough people decide they deserve them. The company that owns the world rose because humanity outsourced responsibility in exchange for convenience. It grew because people believed the system was neutral. It thrived because no one bothered to question who held the voting rights over their wealth. But convenience is no match for awareness. Opacity is no match for scrutiny. And even the most powerful entity on Earth is no match for a population that chooses to open its eyes. The inevitability is not destruction, it is awakening. An awakening to the truth that power is never permanent, that ownership is never absolute, that empires built on silence cannot withstand a world that begins to speak. And so the final image is not collapse, but clarity. A world standing on the edge of a new cycle, aware, alert, unafraid. Because once you see the structure of power, you are no longer inside its illusion. You are standing outside it, looking in. And that is where revolutions begin.